The best lessons in life are often learned outside of the classroom. That's where all the action happens. That's where the rubber meets the road and the hard knocks knock some sense into you. But did you ever wish you could get those lessons without all the fuss? Sign up today and get your first week free. You can cancel at any time.
Hi, I'm Rick Brimacombe of Brimacombe Capital, and on behalf of Lessons from the Garage, welcome to our June podcast, Why Do Business in China? Lessons from the Garage provides insider learning for entrepreneurs. Think of Netflix for business owners and entrepreneurs trying to grow their companies. There are over 200 videos currently and will be over 300 by the end of the year. You can go to the website, lessonsfromthegarage.com, and sign up for a 7-day free trial. Check it out. Lessons from the Garage is powered by the Network Connect. The Network Connect is a platform created to connect investors, companies, preferred service providers, and a catalytic gateway to fuel business growth. To learn more about the Network Connect, go to www.networkconnect. Our events and contacts have helped companies raise millions of dollars, and our monthly newsletters reach thousands of investors and referral groups and tens of thousands of business contacts. Before we get to today's podcast, I'd first like to say thank you to our sponsors, the ROI Group, management consulting company providing international business expertise for growing companies and those looking to expand overseas, and Schwegman Lumber Woosner, otherwise known as SLW, an internationally recognized intellectual property law firm providing patent, trademark, and other IP-related services. Find out more about them at www.slwip.com. Without the generous support of ROI Group and Schwegman Lumber Woosner, events like this wouldn't happen, so please support them to the extent that you can. Likewise, let me know if you'd like to learn more about the sponsorship opportunities with Lessons from the Garage. As far as announcement go, again, Lessons from the Garage can be found at the .com, Lessons from the Garage. Again, think of Netflix for business owners and entrepreneurs. There is a 7-day free trial, as I mentioned, and a couple of hundred videos. The Network Connect, again, is at thenetworkconnect.com, and there's a schedule of events there, as well as you can sign up for the newsletter and get access to Lessons from the Garage. The webinar schedule is in July. We have Monroe Moxness talking about basic legal issues for entrepreneurs. In August, I will be interviewing an investor, and then we go on to accounting in September. Today's speaker is Warren Vollmer, the CEO of the ROI Group. Warren formed the ROI Group nearly 16 years ago after leaving 3M to help small and mid-sized businesses expand internationally. At 3M, he worked at what he calls a corporate skunk works. His job was to analyze new-to-the-world product concepts, and if they met certain criteria, to begin to commercialize them, manufacture, look for partners, channel development, and sales and marketing. Products that he worked on including lithium polymer batteries, superconductive tape, elastic dampers, easy for you to say. Yay! How about that? Separation technologies for biotech and radioactive elements, metal matrix composites, and even, yes, floating concrete. You have to tell us about that one, Warren. As it relates to our conversation today, Warren recently served as 7 years as president of the U.S.-China Business Connection Organization, and that leads us to today's interview with Warren and his presentation. Despite the current political situation between China and the U.S., China offers many opportunities for American businesses. The key to success is going in with your eyes wide open and being well prepared. China is not at all like the U.S. Thinks, many people in the U.S. think, and an introduction points us to some basic differences that you need to know. Today's podcast will cover things like the industrious, creative, and very entrepreneurial proud people, their role of education there and how it either holds them back or pushes them forward, corruption, a historical and ever-present problem, the rule of law and it being a brain twister, autocracy-enabled bureaucracy, and everything there is built on relationships and not like what you might think. So with that, I'll turn it over to Warren. Warren, thank you for joining us, and I'll say for our audience, I've known you for many, many years. It's a pleasure to have you. Your breadth of experience both at 3M and with China is wonderful. It's a great addition to add you to the library, and a real honor to have you here. So thank you and welcome, and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. And since you brought up the floating concrete with a question, what is it? Actually, it's a very simple concept. You know, concrete is usually very heavy and it's strong.
Absolutely.
And there are many countries that are putting buildings into the ocean areas. So when you build something in the ocean, it's very difficult to pour the concrete down into the base and on the floor of the ocean and whatnot. There are many difficulties with that, obviously drying and takes a long time and that sort of thing. So we at 3M, they were asked to come up with a concept of how to handle that problem. And the obvious thing is to have the concrete solidify on top of the ocean instead of down at the bottom of the ocean.
Okay.
And so what 3M came up with was another one of their products, glass bubbles. They put the glass bubbles into the concrete, and glass bubbles are filled with air. A sphere is the strongest type of geometric design that there is. So it not only increased the strength of the concrete, it added lightness to it. And what it enabled was that as you poured the concrete in, the form and whatnot, it would slowly sink down to the bottom, but it would cure from the top down. So that was the solution. So a lot of things, the simplest things, or I should say the simplest solutions are often the best. That's one of the things that I learned from Art Fry, the inventor of Post-it notes. So,
all right. And let me ask too, because some of our audience might not be familiar with the term Skunk Works, and that may come from, in part, your military background, which we'll talk about later. But tell us a little bit about that to the extent that you can without necessarily having to shoot us after you share.
I won't have to shoot anybody. Skunk Works is basically just a very innovative type of group that works on new concepts. And in the situation at 3M, all that we worked on were new to the world types of products, literally new to the world, not a change in design, not a change in color or something like that. These were literally new to the world. And number one, it was fascinating, exciting. But we had a small group that would come together and we would work with the scientists and that sort of thing. And it was a matter of generating ideas and new ways of handling things. So the Skunk Works was a informal type of term that described this very creative process. And it was challenging all the times. I mean, you've got many different organizations that use the same concept. Apple uses that, and you know, just about every digital type of company that you have has a Skunk Works of sorts.
Okay.
And really, when you think about it, entrepreneurs are developing their own types of Skunk Works.
Sure, they're doing stuff under the radar. They haven't launched yet, coming up with new ideas and hopefully new to the world concepts. Okay, so with that, tell us about China and how to do business there.
Okay, but maybe Rick, before we get into the topic, what we should do is address the elephant in the room. And you already,
absolutely,
you already brought it up a little bit. We have a tariff, a trade war going on with China right now. And that is a situation that it stems from a lot of legitimate concerns that business and countries have had with China for quite some time. Like I say, these are legitimate concerns. Probably the biggest concern that companies have is the transfer of technology into China. Many people think that the Chinese government dictates that the certain technologies will be brought in. To my knowledge, that technically is not correct. To my knowledge, the nation of China has not dictated that certain technology or scientific information and whatnot must be passed into China. But what they do is that they encourage their businesses to ask for that sort of thing or to require that in contracts and that sort of thing. And of course, businesses wanting to be successful or to continue, they will do that sort of thing. So it's a way of getting around not doing something as a nation, but actually making it happen.
So is it a kind of a quid pro quo, or is it more of a must-have from the business perspective and the Chinese saying, hey, we need some technology transfer to do business with you, or is it encouraged or a requirement?
It really depends on the business and the strength of the American negotiation skills. If you're strong enough, if you can push back on that sort of thing, you can be successful.
Okay. All right.
Like I say, it's really up to the negotiating skills of the people involved, and also obviously it's a matter of how badly China wants that type of business into the nation, and how bad we want to be in that type of business. Right. So it's a toss-up.
Okay.
The other thing, of course, is the patent and trademark protection. It kind of goes hand in hand. Another one of the things that people are not aware of as far as patents in China goes is that the vast majority, close to 70% of their patents, are non-functional patents. Okay, they are basically worthless patents. They are about a new color, a new design, a new whatever. It's an offshoot, so it's really worthless. As far as China's identification of the number of patents that have been filed in the country, they can legitimately say that they are now producing more patents than any other country in the world. But consider that 70% of them are worthless.
Sure.
So that's one thing that we have to be aware of. You also have to be aware that if you are going into China, you really have to consider your own patent situation. Do you have your patents in just the United States? Do you have them through Europe? Do you have them worldwide? How do you have your patent portfolio set up? And that's something that you really need to work with intellectual property lawyers with.
Like the folks at Schwegman Lumber Woosner.
That's right. So, and there are many ways of looking at that. The podcast that they're going to do is going to be very valuable for anybody that's thinking of doing international work, but especially into China. The Chinese are also very good at protecting their industries and even specific companies. And this goes along with something of the nationalist type of attitude that many countries, including the United States and in the world today, have. They have been protectionist for a long time. They manage that frequently through rules and processes that they set up, which can change on a daily basis sometimes. It's very hard to keep up with those. But that is one way that they will make sure that the things that they are concerned about doing in China, the industries that they want to succeed, the businesses that they want to exceed, are protected in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And that can be accomplished not only at the national level, but down through the provinces and right down to cities and towns. So you have to be very aware of that, and it takes a good relationship and a good understanding of what is happening in China from the regulatory standpoint, from the government standpoint. Their SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, the companies that China as a nation has a equity position in. They may own the company completely, or they may have a partial equity in the company. They control or they manage those companies very severely, let's say.
Okay, all right.
They do that primarily from a financial standpoint. They can control, since they basically control the monetary situation in all of China, unlike in the United States, where the Fed has a very strong presence and individual banks can make their own decisions and that sort of thing. In China, the government controls the financial situation. So the government can determine how much money the state-owned enterprises should get. They can determine the loans and loan structure that the SOEs get and that sort of thing. And obviously they can dictate the product areas and that sort of thing that the companies operate in, or their acquisitions and whatnot. It is a very strong control. I think, fortunately for us in the United States, most of the state-owned companies are very poorly run.
Okay.
And most of them operate at a deficit, but that's not something that you would normally find out about on a regular basis. They do something of the same thing with specialty types of companies that they are concerned about. Let's say that robotics, for instance, they want to advance robotics, which they do. So they may pick a number of robotics companies and encourage a bank to provide them with a loan at 0% interest, or they don't have to pay it back for a long time. There are many ways of handling that sort of thing. So those types of government administrative things are very prominent in China. They do create an unfair playing field. And it's something that not only the United States, but other countries, developed countries, are very concerned about and are trying to fight. Now, the United States, with the current administration, is fighting that through the tariffs. And there is a trade war. The trade war hopefully will not last forever, but hopefully it will bring about some changes in those types of governing factors that China uses. I don't hold out a lot of hope for that, though, unfortunately.
All right.
And the reason for that is that China is also a very nationalist country. The country has a very long memory, if I can personify the entire country. They are still smarting over the century of humiliation in the 1800s. That was a time period when the British and the French and the Portuguese and whatnot went to China. It was during the Opium Wars and all that sort of thing, and they forced China into trade concessions that China did not want. And that lasted for 100 years, i.e. the century of humiliation. And that is something that, if you get into a discussion of who's doing something right as far as the country goes, who's doing something wrong, it will be brought up.
Okay.
And the best thing to do is to avoid that.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of a background of where we are as far as the negative things about China. But in spite of that, China is a huge market with vast promise. And it is the reason that my company is involved with China. And we are trying to take advantage of that and help the global situation by creating business between our countries and whatnot. China is vastly different from the United States. But the thing about China is, and you mentioned it, you are only going to succeed if you go in there with your eyes wide open. You have to know and understand what is going on in China. It takes a great deal of learning, and it takes a great deal of effort in order to make sure that you are at least attempting to do things right. When you go into almost any country, I was traveling through France, and my wife at the time spoke a tiny bit of French. She spoke fluent Spanish. I spoke English and a tiny bit of German. And we went through 3 languages before we got to a point where they settled on Spanish as the language. And then all of a sudden, everybody was happy. I mean, we had the best meal at that restaurant that we ever had.
Sure.
But it's one of those types of things where people open up to you if you try to learn a little bit about them, especially if you try to learn a little bit of the language,
Sure.
which is very hard in China. This is modern China. Thousands and thousands of people crowding the streets and whatnot. No matter where you go, you see just huge numbers of people. They've got 1.4 billion people in the country. That's 20% of the world's population. Everything in that country is new. No matter where you look, there are new buildings and whatnot. They just started developing China in the late 80s. When Deng Xiaoping he came to power right after Mao Zedong, and he brought about the concept of a new type of marketplace with Chinese considerations, and so he was trying to develop things on a slow basis, but the things that he developed have just escalated tremendously. It's been a very explosive type of transition to a new world economy. And it's amazing if you look at where they came from. A very agrarian economy. The people there subsisted on that farming type of economy for thousands of years. And now they were moving into something totally different. And it's been very traumatic for all the citizens in China, and it's completely new. This is the new type of China. Wherever you look in the cities, there are buildings being built. You can look out of a hotel room, and all that you will see are giant cranes on top of buildings. It's just a sea of cranes where new things are going up. It's a high density type of society now. And their small towns may have a few 100,000 people. That's the Twin Cities. So that's a small town. A small city might be 1 million people. You look at Beijing and Shanghai, they've got 20 million people. So they're big cities. Everything is growing. The infrastructure is extremely modern, and this is something that a country like China has an advantage over the United States because it's an autocratic type of country, communist, and they can do what they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. When they built the Three Gorges Dam, they literally moved millions of people out of their villages and whatnot. They flooded over historic sites and whatnot, and they just said, well, it's been nice knowing you. Have fun in your new place. It's about 50 miles down the road. Have a good night. And they're able to do that. We obviously can't do that. We have to, pay attention to laws and privacy and all different types of things. Personally, I like the fact that somebody can't throw me out of my house. But anyway, their infrastructure is all new, built within the last 20 years. And they are constantly building things every day. Rail is their preferred mode of transportation. Both with high-speed rail and in subways, which are really the undercurrent of every city. If you go to Beijing, they have a tremendous complex that it almost rivals the highway system and whatnot underneath the city. So you can travel anywhere that you want with that type of complex. And the people The people are wired. They all live off of their phones, and in many different ways. 802 million internet users are currently around in China. 98% of those have, well, they're internet or mobile internet users. My tongue is getting tied too. 71% of those people use mobile payment systems, and that, now my information is a couple of months old, so my bet is that that's up considerably by now. Everywhere that you go, you will see people paying with their phones by putting it up to the checkout system and whatnot, or they're ordering food, or so many things. Nothing is done without that mobile payment. They have 11 times the number of mobile payment people that the United States does. So it's huge. One of the things that is really taking effect right now is the use of mobile ordering and payments for food for every meal. Typically, because the Chinese have small refrigerators and small places to live and whatnot, they frequently shop on a daily basis. So they're even having produce ordered over the internet and delivered to them, and then they pay with their phone. Another thing that's happening is that you can go into a shopping mall and you will see a grocery store, a retail store, and there's not a soul in sight. Okay, so you think, at least as far as staff goes, and you think, okay, where's the person to check me out? Well, they don't have anybody to check you out. You do that yourself. It's all self-serve, and they stock at night, and they don't have any employees and whatnot, which seems to be a little bit of a contradiction, because they've got 1.4 billion people that they have to employ, at least to some extent. But now they're trying to get away from some employment. So it's a contradiction. They pay extremely close attention to their education, and one of the things, as I mentioned before, about the patents and the products and whatnot that they produce, their President Xi has announced a number of industries and scientific areas that China wants to become the #1 world leader in. There are all types of things: supercomputers, green energy, robotics, aerospace, biotechnology, and of course, artificial intelligence. In Beijing alone, I just looked this past week, and there are several hundred companies incorporating AI, or artificial intelligence, to produce products or processes in Beijing alone. In Henan province, which is not too far from Beijing, they have literally hundreds of companies that are producing the same type of product. And that's a factor of how big the country is, how they have had to sell, and that sort of thing. And that gets to a point that I'll touch on a little bit later. But let's talk about the workforce a little bit, because this is a key factor. They have 4.6 million people studying STEM types of college courses right now. As of 2016, so it's even more than that now. There are 3 times the number of engineering students or graduates than in the United States. And just those 2 things should cause you to worry a little bit, because the United States is getting behind in that, and we have to solve that problem. They have the world's fastest growing middle class at this point in time. There are currently 430 million in their middle class. Their average annual wage is around $15,000, which doesn't sound like much, but when things are so much cheaper, that makes a big difference. There are expected to be 780 million by 2005 in the middle class. Their consumer wealth is skyrocketing, and one aspect of that is very important for us in the United States to know about is that 25% of the average salary for a Chinese person goes into savings. That compares with average savings in the United States, which is just above zero.
I'd say negative.
So that does bring up one thing, and that's that the Chinese, especially people in the middle class, have a very large amount of money to play with. They have more millionaires and billionaires than the United States. So they're making very great progress in that respect. And if you're looking for investments and whatnot, China is a place to find that money. But I would warn you that it will take a long time to find the money from China, and it will be difficult, especially now with the trade war,
Sure.
to get it out.
Sure.
So, more about the people. They are extremely industrious. Just the fact that within the past 50 years, 40 years, they have gone from the Cultural Revolution, where they basically had nothing, to the point that they are at today. They are inventive, and they are adept at finding new ways of doing things. This brings up a point about patents. One of the things that people complain about is patent theft. And you have to understand that in China, they have a totally different awareness of what theft is. In China, if something is sold into the public, it is considered to be in the public domain. Okay, that means that anybody can take that product and change it. So they don't see that as theft. They see that as doing the right thing that's going to benefit somebody. And that really impacts your patent portfolio in China. And it's something that you have to be aware of. So you either need to create security for the way that your product is manufactured, if you're a wholly owned company over in China, or if you're dealing through a joint venture or something of that nature, security has to be one of your top concerns. And China is, as I said, growing tremendously. There are many things that are a factor of that growth. And from the Chinese standpoint, that is not always a positive aspect. Because think of the big cities. Those cities have tremendous logistical challenges. How do you get food to the people? How do you get all the necessities of life to 8 million people when the streets are clogged every day? They find ways around that. They have 5 times the number of people crowding their roads and their trains and their planes than we do here in the United States. And sometimes we have trouble. So, this is another thing about their inventiveness. I don't want to call it creativeness, because that is a problem that they have. They are not a problem, but they are not as creative as people in the United States are, which is one of our strong points. But they are inventive. So they know how to get things changed in order to make them usable or to save time. If you're doing just-in-time manufacturing, you have to plan out with your Chinese partners or whomever, how do you get parts in and out of a small city of 5, 6, or 8 million people? How do you do it dependably? And how do you accomplish it that in an easy way? Now, the Chinese have found that they can do that by regulating things. They regulate the number of people that can buy cars, when you can buy a car, how often you can drive your car, where you are going to park it, if you get a license plate for that car. They have many different ways of regulating something like that. And the Chinese are very disciplined people, so they follow the regulations. And that's not something that we would be able to do over here. It makes things a little bit easier to do in China than you would have here. So if you look at the new China, here's Hong Kong, and looking at, again, the massive number of people in a city, they need a lot of things that they're building to house those people, but at the same time, it's creating problems. By building cities, they take away agricultural land, and they increase the amount of concrete and that sort of thing. So it impacts how you're traveling, and it also impacts the environment. Much of the environment has been despoiled because of the urbanization and from the past of the massive industrialization, where companies didn't care about the environment or where they dump their solid waste or anything of that nature, and that has brought about problems today. One of the things that you will find, which is an opportunity for us here in the United States, is that anywhere in industry that you find or identify that the Chinese have had rapid growth, you can find things that have been negatively impacted by that, where we probably have the answer. Okay. So anything dealing with the environment, whether it's air pollution or land pollution, water pollution, whatever, those are opportunities for U.S. companies. And one of the prime examples of that is, my information on this is old now, by at least 2 or 3 years. And the country put up 60 new water pollution plants to serve cities. Now, that was big news, and the Chinese, were lauding that as fantastic advances and whatnot. The problem was that not one of those 60 water pollution plants treated more than one type of pollution, and there are dozens of types of pollution. And out of those 60 plants, they only performed, each one of them only was operating at 60% capacity. So 40% was untreated, going right into the environment and whatnot. So those are the types of things where you look for opportunities, and you can find those opportunities almost anywhere. Safety is a factor that the Chinese have long not had great concerns about. When you've got 1.4 billion people, if a few are lost along the way because of a safety problem, it may not be noticed. So, that's an area where we can provide solutions and whatnot. One solution that has been selected by the Chinese government to help their massive number of people is to build high-rises, one next to each other. And in their current 5-year plan, they are looking at building 60 new cities of at least 1 million people or more. And basically what they're going to be...
Say that one more time. 60 cities of 1 million or more.
That's right. And they are going to be generally building those cities as satellites around existing cities. So if you think of Beijing, that may have 5 or 6 additional cities built around it. we would think of that as a suburb, okay? A city of 1 million people, to them, is a suburb too. But that's what they're doing in order to house their people. And that's just going to exasperate their problems. It provides solutions, but it exasperates their problems at the same time. So again, it brings up opportunities for us. Healthcare is a big area where the Chinese are way behind us in technology and whatnot. Even though we buy some medical equipment from them, overall they're well behind us in the medical area. Another area is in pension benefits and things of that nature, taking care of the aged. They have very few facilities for taking care of aged people. And the people in rural areas, granted, many of the people from rural areas of the country, the central areas and northern parts of China have moved into the cities for jobs and whatnot, but there's still a lot of people out in the country. This was a very big problem for the Chinese because young people move to the cities to have jobs. As they move to the cities, they basically changed some of their attitudes. Traditional attitude was children take care of the family. So children take care of the parents, parents take care of the grandparents. You would frequently see 3 generations in each household. Now all of a sudden the young children are gone. And if they had children, if the children had babies, frequently they would send them back to the parents for the parents to take care of. Who takes care of the parents when the children are gone and there's no money coming in from those extra hands? So that has created a very severe pension problem. China does have a pension system. It does not cover, it only covers a very small portion of the population. And it's something like $15 a month or something. So it's not a living wage. There are ample opportunities like that. All you have to do is look. This is a typical shot of what pollution is like in some of the really bad parts of China. I believe that this is in an area that is not too far from Beijing, between Beijing and North Korea.
Has the pollution in Beijing gotten better at all, or is it actually worse? I've heard horror stories. I've never been myself, but I've heard horror stories from the people who have gone.
Well, the last time that I went, it was much better than it had been. Although I looked out at my hotel room in the early morning, and I could only see about 2 buildings over, so maybe 2 blocks. And the rest was small. In Beijing, for instance, for the Olympics, what they did was they shut down all the factories for a number of miles, like 50 miles. And that cleared up the air quite considerably. They also stopped a lot of the car traffic. And that obviously had a great deal to solve the pollution problem. One of the things that China is also trying to lead in is in electric vehicles. They are just pouring out electric vehicles, and President Xi has directed that they would be all electric, I believe, by 2025, if I have my dates correct. Now, the electric vehicles that we have with Tesla and others that are working on our electric vehicles are much different than what you will find in China, but it still is an impact, and it gives us a market too.
Sure.
So thinking of all of these things, it's really created the second largest economy at a really great expense. And there's been a lot of problems with the health of people because of pollution, social destruction with the movement of people into cities and the parental hierarchy and that sort of thing. There's continuing corruption. President Xi has had a crackdown on corruption for the last at least 2 years. I think it's longer than that. And I do know that there were something in the neighborhood of 100,000 people put in jail for corruption from government and businesses and whatnot. That's what they announced, so the figure is probably a lot more. It presents problems. Corruption is always a concern, and it's something that we as Americans and Americans who have to abide by both the American system of laws and the somewhat lack of laws, the rule of law in China, and the prospects of coming up against some requests for bribery and that sort of thing. You have to be careful of that. Just as they say no. The Chinese government is also doing a very comprehensive matter of surveillance of all the people in China. You may have heard of the Great Firewall. The Great Firewall is control of the internet, and the Chinese government does that very thoroughly. At one point, I heard that there were some 30,000 people that worked on censoring the internet. So that's a lot. Again, that's probably a very low figure. That's what was identified. You will go into areas where there are cameras on every corner. They are looking at facial recognition. There are hundreds and hundreds of companies that are working on facial recognition. So no matter where you go, and no matter who you are going to be identified. And that somewhat takes us to the concept of 1984, which is, to me, that's very disturbing. I will not work with any company that is working on facial recognition in China or has anything to do with their surveillance and whatnot, just out of a matter of principle. But that is something that you do have to be concerned about. Each of the challenges that China faces presents opportunities for American businesses. You know, while China's moving fast, it still lags behind, and it's dependent on the creativity and the innovation that are the strength of American companies. Trade deficits are narrowed by exporting more. Only 5% of the companies in the United States export, and the majority of those exports go to Mexico and Canada. So we need to do more exporting.
Sure.
That's the way to accomplish a balance of trade deficits, not by taxing more. To summarize, to summarize Sun Tzu, the great Chinese military tacticians, know your competitor. Know your competitor. And that's what you have to do to operate in China. So if you want to look at our takeaways, what
Sure.
I would suggest that you remember about this presentation is that China is very different from the United States, extremely different. Do not plan on taking your operations here and transplanting them in China. That is guaranteed failure, guaranteed. The current economic situation makes business quite difficult, but it is not impossible. It's just difficult. You know, that's one of the American standards, you know. We can, you know, perform the difficult things. Miracles take a little bit longer. Learn and accept what motivates the Chinese and what drives their ambition. They are very ambitious people. So learn what motivates them. In a lot of instances, especially with young people, That's going to be money. Okay, so learn what is their hot button. China's progress has been made at great expense. Those expenses, as I mentioned, such as pollution, health, social welfare, all those types of things, present opportunities for us. Every problem created opens an opportunity door for America. And if you do business in China, do it with your eyes wide open. Be patient when you go to China. Be flexible and adapt. That is the key. Be like the Chinese and adapt. That's it.
Great, thank you, Warren. So I have a couple of questions here. First, want to start out with, I noticed in your bio that you're a retired lieutenant colonel from the U.S. Army. Tell us a little bit about that and maybe a couple of takeaways that you transferred to your business career.
I'm glad you put it that way, because that really gives me an opportunity to talk about the type of things that I did in the military. If you have seen the movie The Great Escape, James Garner played a scrounger in the movie. I mean, if you needed something, you went to James Garner, and he would find it. Okay, a lot of the things that I did in the military were as a scrounger. I was given the opportunity, when I was a major, to literally start up a new unit. And I was the first one to do that, to my knowledge, for the past 10 years in the entire military. And when the general, I turned him down. He wanted me to actually started with the colonel. My colonel said, "Yep, we want you to head this unit." I said, "No, I've got family problems. I can't do that." He asked me again. I said, "No." The next thing was that I got a call from the general, and we had lunch. And he said, "Major, you are going to run this unit." And I said, "Yes, sir." And I asked him, "How many people do I have?" He said, "You're the first." "Okay. How much budget do I have?" "You have my full support." That meant zero. Okay. I had no budget. "How many people, how much equipment and whatnot do I have?" "You have my full support." I was able to wrangle my sergeant, my operations sergeant, from my old unit. So he and I started that unit, and we were given 3 years to get it to operational satisfaction and do several missions. We did it in a year and a half.
Okay.
There was one time when we went up to our training site. This is a tank unit, an armored unit. And we went up to a training site, and the tanks that we were supposed to train with weren't there. But there was a railroad train stopped on a siding with 5 tanks on it. So we took our universal key, which happens to be a chain breaker, and we undid the tanks from being tied down with chains on the track on the cars. And we used those tanks for the day, put them back, washed them up, filled them, with gas, and left a note saying, with a padlock saying, "Here's your new combination." So a lot of the things that I did were not the norm.
Okay.
And that really gave me great training for 3M and for a lot of the other things that I did. It taught me to think outside the box, to use that cliche. I've always been very fortunate in surrounding myself with people, or being surrounded by people who were very creative, who were very smart, smarter than me. And, that doesn't take much, but, I was very fortunate in that respect. And when you're working with people like that who are always looking at the alternatives, always looking at the solution instead of the problem, that really makes a difference in things that you can accomplish.
Sure. So things like you talked about in your presentation about being adaptive, innovative, inventive, things like that, and doing business with China came from your days of busting locks with the universal
Yes.
key in the Army. All right, so you started this conversation with talking about tariffs and such. Chinese put a lot of tariffs on us. There's not, quote unquote, free trade, and IP theft is an issue. So if you had a magic wand and could do things how you want to do them, how would you try to get the Chinese to do what we would like, which is lower the tariffs, make more free trade, and cut back on the IP theft? How would you accomplish that?
Well, the first thing is that they don't respond well to threats. And this goes way back in their history, thousands of years. China started with warlords, and literally they had warlords and emperors throughout their history up until the time of Mao. So, it was whoever was the strongest. And this is where corruption starts also, because if you have an emperor and the emperor likes to have nice things and whatnot, if you ingratiate yourself to that emperor by offering goods or riches or whatever, that will appease the emperor. Mm-hmm. And China had a unique way of thinking that also backs all this up. They looked at China as the center of the universe. Okay, China was the center of civilization. All countries outside of China were barbarian, and some people in China today still think of people from outside of China as barbarians. They won't say that, but that's the way they think of it. So, taking that into effect, into account, they are not impressed by people who try to manipulate them and whatnot, because they are master manipulators. If you try to outsmart them by trickery, you're going to lose. It just doesn't work. So, the first thing, don't do things like tariffs. Do things that are going to impact them from a positive standpoint and give them a little bit of what they want, while trying to get more of what we need. For instance, we had been bringing many students over from China to go to our colleges and postgraduate and whatnot. That was something that China dearly loved, because they so appreciate education. Well, in my view, we made a little mistake. Yeah, exactly. You can either turn it off, or you can use it to your advantage. You can have those people come over here and say, if you want a master's degree or a doctorate degree, fine. Okay, do the research. You have to do approved research, and you will have to stay here for 5 years or whatever, and work here and make sure that nothing is going back to China that's not supposed to. So that's the type of thing that we could do that would impact them, and the more of those people that we educate here, the better our relationship is with young people, and they want to change China. Some of the young people that I work with who have studied over here and whatnot are very concerned about all the surveillance and whatnot. But in general, the Chinese, because they are a group that follows orders, mm-hmm. are willing to put up with those things. They don't see it as a problem. The people who have studied over here do. That makes a big difference. This week, there was a demonstration in Hong Kong that probably had 1 million people in it that were demonstrating against the national government trying to impose stricter standards. basically for extraditing people that they thought were criminals or whatever. That gives them great opportunity to extradite anybody. So you work on those types of things to make little advances. The Chinese look long term. We don't. Okay, we need to sometimes look a little bit longer term too, and we need to get them to see that it's to their advantage to do things like not have as protective an attitude about a particular industry, robotics or AI or biotech, whatever, and that by working together, we accomplish more.
Okay. Let's say I have a small niche company. Like most small companies, there's limited resources. I have limited money. I have limited people. I have limited time. What's the best way for kind of smaller niche companies to navigate and do business in China? I mean, it's easy to say, well, I'm Medtronic and I'm going to China and here's how I'm going to do it. But for kind of us commoners, if you will, how do we do business in China?
Well, actually, the opportunities for working in China as a small company, or working with small companies in China, are far bigger than the opportunities for big companies, because there are so many. There are literally millions of companies like that in China. And that's where most of our industry is too. That's where most of our employment is. So there are many ways of doing that. 3 to 5 years ago, joint ventures were the big thing to do in China. That's fallen by the wayside. Acquisitions are taking place, taking minority positions in companies in China, or working as a wholly owned company is also an opportunity. And that goes both ways. I mean, it can be an investment from a Chinese company into a small company here, or vice versa. That gives you an opportunity. The vetting that you do of companies over there is extremely important, because as I said, there's so many companies doing exactly the same thing. In Henan province that I was talking about before, there are more than 100 companies that make inflatable bounce toys and that sort of thing. And I mean, where did they sell them? 100 companies making that type of thing. You just wonder where they sell it. So your vetting of that is very important. For the Chinese, everything is the world's best, and they all do R&D. Okay, every single company that you look at will have that. They're very deep into R&D. So you have to be careful about your vetting, learn what is true about the company. And frequently the best way to do that is to contact an accounting company or an auditing company, and if you're at your serious point, and have them go and do an audit of the company itself. See if their manufacturing is exactly what they say it is, and the same as what's shown on their website and all that sort of thing. So that is one thing. Another thing is link up with somebody that knows what they're doing in China.
In country.
Yeah, in country. There are many expats over there, lots of experience. There are people here in the United States that have done that type of work. Talk to other companies that have done the same sort of thing. When Emerson here in the Twin Cities was working on moving into China, and I can't remember the name of the former company. Emerson bought the company, but the first company that tried to go in failed miserably. The second time they tried to go in as Emerson, they relied on people who had worked on it before, who had gone into China. They talked to dozens and dozens of companies that had gone into China. Everybody wants to help, so they had no problem getting information. And you can do the same thing in China. You go to China and spend time, excuse me, learning about the area, the facilities, the industry, et cetera. You talk to the expats, you talk to law firms, you talk to accounting firms, all those sorts of things to gather information. And yes, you need to develop relationships. Plan on spending a lot of time at dinners and whatnot where, and don't drink too much because they want to toast everything. So,
All right, don't drink too much. Good lesson for a thing. All right, last question. We ran a little bit long, but it's been a good conversation, very enlightening, lots of good detail and guidance here. You mentioned several types of products that were good opportunities for U.S. businesses. Talked about green energy, safety, healthcare, without going into a lot of background as to in-depth reasons why. Just give me a couple of the other categories that you think would be a valuable opportunity for U.S. companies to go to China with.
That question I didn't expect.
It was off script, but that's why you get paid the big bucks, is because I'm throwing you the curveball. So I wrote them down, and you said, hey, green,
Yep.
clean, safety, healthcare were a couple of the, and maybe you just say, hey, those are the best ones and focus on those. But if there are other ones that came to mind.
My focus as a company is more in the industrial area and that sort of thing. Retail in China is really difficult, and it changes constantly. And this retail of almost any sort, whether it's agricultural, food and that sort of thing, or if it's clothing and purses and whatnot. It is now swinging to the point where it had previously been you do those things out of a storefront. Then it went to completely internet. Now it's swinging over to a combination of the two. You have to have a retail store, but plan on no sales out of your retail store because the people will come in, look at, say, my phone and say, is this the same thing that looks on that I have on my phone? And yes, I like what's in front of me, and I'll go outside and I'll order it on my phone. That's the way it works, okay? Whether it's food or purses or whatever. Don't try and sell toys into China because China makes all the toys. So that's something that you don't want to get into. Anything dealing with water, whether it's in-ground, above-ground, polluted water, anything of that nature is extremely important because one of the things about China is that they have only about 20%, I believe, of the agricultural land to feed this 1.4 billion people. So land and water are the two biggest things that they need and are not replaceable. So anything that you can do to impact that, whether it's on eliminating desertification or cleaning water or providing water, so anything of that nature. Transportation is extremely important to them, so anything dealing with transportation, and that goes from some of the types of circuitry. Anything electronic is good to look at, but look at it from an industry standpoint rather than I'm going to provide a commodity product like a connector or something of that nature. So if you can provide circuitry or types of equipment that operate trains, planes, that sort of thing is very important. Their aerospace area that's a area of concern, but it is also an area of great opportunity because they're in their infancy in spite of going to the moon and that sort of thing. You'll be restricted as to where you can get into the aerospace industry, but it's still an opportunity. Those are some just off the top of my head.
Okay. All All right, well, other than calling you up to plan my trip to China and get some tidbits on what I should or should not do.
Tourism is a good thing.
So I'll save that one for another day. Thank you all for joining us. It was a real treat, Warren. Thank you for being here. Again, lessonsfromthegarage.com as well as the networkconnect.com. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next month.
The best lessons in life are often learned outside of the classroom. That's where all the action happens. That's where the rubber meets the road and the hard knocks knock some sense into you. But did you ever wish you could get those lessons without all the fuss? Sign up today and get your first week free. You can cancel at any time.